So it's 8 a.m. in your side.
It is,
Yeah.
yeah.
Yeah. It's 8 p.m. right here in Beijing. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
I used to have a collaborator in Shanghai, and
Oh, really?
finding a time to meet was impossible.
Yeah. Okay. I think we're on time. So good evening, everyone. Welcome to Frontiers in Health Communication Research course at the School of Journalism and Communication at Peking University. And I appreciate you taking the time to join us today. And today we're pretty honored to have a world-renowned scholar, Professor Leticia Bode, to deliver a talk on misinformation correction on social media. I gather that many of you have already been quite familiar with Dr. Bode's research, which has been quite impactful, especially in the domains of health communication and political communication. And if you do misinformation research, it's even more unlikely that you did not notice and read Dr. Bode's research. But still, I would like to briefly introduce our guest to the audience today, as I see quite a large number of the audiences in our conference room. So Dr. Leticia Bode is an associate professor in the Communication, Culture, and Technology Master's Program at Georgetown University, and she received her PhD in political science from the University of Wisconsin-Madison. Her work lies at the intersection of communication, technology, and political behavior, which emphasizes the role of communication and information technologies that may play in the acquisition of and use of political information. And many of Dr. Bode's research has appeared in top-tier journals like JOC, like Journal of Computer-Mediated Communication, and New Media and Society, among others. And also, Dr. Bode sits on the editorial board of a series of prestigious journals such as Social Media and Society and Journal of Information Technology and Politics, and so forth. So today, the topic of Dr. Bode's talk is correcting misinformation on social media. Okay, Dr. Bode, thanks so much for joining us today. So if you're ready, let's get the ball rolling.
Thank you, Jan, for such a nice introduction. That was really kind. So I'm really happy to be here. It is almost as good as actually being there with you guys in person, but we'll make the best of it. And today I will be talking a little bit about some pieces of a forthcoming book, which we are kind of in final revision stages, maybe of. It feels like it's never ending, the editing. So I will, let's see, get my screen up. And okay, so this is a collaboration, an ongoing collaboration with my co-author Emily Fraga at the University of Minnesota. We've been working together on misinformation research since 2014. So going on a decade of research that is all going into this book, along with a whole lot of new data collections that I'll talk about as well. So today I want to ask and answer a few questions about observed correction, which is the focus of our book. And the first question that you may have is, what is that? I don't know what that is. I've never heard of it. So I'll talk about that, how we define it and what its requirements are, and why we think that that's important. I'll talk about whether it makes people more accurate to see correction on social media. Do professional communicators engage in this kind of correction? Do social media users engage in this kind of correction? And can we get them to correct more? And that last question will feature data that was collected yesterday. So you guys are the first people to see this data. You should feel very special because we're very excited about it. Okay, so first of all, what is observed correction? So we have 3 requirements of observed correction. And roughly speaking, when I say observed correction, what I'm talking about is somebody corrects somebody else on social media. So somebody shares misinformation, somebody corrects that misinformation, and whoever else is on social media, depending on the affordances of the platform, how visible that content is to other people, they get to see that correction as well. So that's the observed part, right? Is other people, besides the people that are participating in the correction, get to witness it. So the first requirement of this is that it is a direct rebuttal. So There are lots of different ways that people engage with each other on social media, but the affordances of social media often allow people to kind of directly respond to one another. So this is kind of a funny example that I found where somebody is talking about the music in a video game on YouTube, and someone is replying to them. Now, this is not a correction because they were not sharing misinformation, and the person is not replying with accurate information, but you can see the kind of typical, right? And we think of this as like a very typical way that social media is set up in a threaded comment kind of system, right? So you have the original post, or in this case, it was actually an original comment, and then threaded comments underneath it. In this case, the original comment is red and the threaded comments underneath are yellow. And in this case, they're disagreeing over what the best music in a video game is. So very important topic of conversation, obviously. The second aspect, so we need to have the ability for direct rebuttal to exist, and then people have to actually use it. And that's important to note because we actually see in our research, people will talk a lot about, I wanted to correct someone, but that felt uncomfortable using this kind of system here. And so instead I did it in some other way. So either I talked to them on a different platform entirely, or I posted correct information, but like on a post on my own timeline, as opposed to like indirect rebuttal to them. And we think that direct rebuttal is important because it means that there is no question that it is actually responding to the misinformation. Whereas if I just share accurate information about, the 2024 election process or something like that on my timeline, maybe I'm sharing it in response to somebody having shared misinformation, but maybe I just, felt the need to share accurate information with my networks. So that's an important distinction. The second requirement of observed correction is that you're including accurate information. And this maybe seems obvious, but obviously we don't want to count anything as correction that is not actually accurate. So going back to this example, this is, again, not accurate information, right? It's just opinions. This does not count as correction because nobody is actually sharing any factual information here. On the other hand, we do see this happen somewhat frequently in the real world. So this is an example that I pulled from earlier this year about the HPV vaccine. In this case, somebody is quote tweeting a post from this America's Frontline Doctors, which is kind of a known purveyor of misinformation. And they have various pieces of accurate information that they include in this rebuttal. So just saying this is not true is enough for us to count it as accurate information, right? If you're responding to misinformation and saying it's not true, that's accurate information. But then he also includes all this other information about HPV vaccine preventing cancer and what are the statistics that we know about that and stuff like that. Notably, the last statement here, stop lying, is not accurate information. So that's just, I don't know, his colorful way of adding to the correction here. And the third requirement, and probably the most important requirement of observed correction, is the observed part. So somebody has to witness correction in order for it to count as observed correction. And this is due to kind of the networked nature of social media, which we often think of the networked nature of social media as being bad for misinformation because it allows misinformation to spread very quickly from person to person in a way that was less likely before we had this kind of online network that existed, right? So misinformation has always been around. People have always spread misinformation and will continue to do so in offline ways. But this kind of makes it easier and faster and bigger spread. But it also gives an opportunity for the correction to spread as well and be seen by lots of people. So as an example of what this can look like, this is one of my favorite corrections that we've ever found, which is very early in the pandemic. So this was really before people knew what was going on, March 2020. This guy shared that he was making hand sanitizer out of vodka and tagged this particular vodka brand in his post. And that vodka brand miraculously took it upon themselves to correct this gentleman and explained that you can't make hand sanitizer out of alcohol because it doesn't have a high enough alcohol, or out of vodka because it doesn't have a high enough alcohol content, and talks about the CDC recommendations, right? This is kind of like a platonic ideal of a correction coming from a vodka company. So you never know where accurate information is going to come from in the world. But because of the affordances of social media, even though I don't follow the guy whose name I have erased here that shared the original post, I don't follow him, and I don't follow Tito's Vodka, but I still got to see this post, right? As it goes viral and the algorithm pushes it to more people have the opportunity to see that correction. So that is probably the most important part of observed correction, is that ability to watch someone else get corrected. So now that we know what observed correction is, why do we care about it? Well, when we first tested this in 2014, we thought, maybe this will positively affect people's belief accuracy to see other people be corrected. And there's a long literature on correction in general of misinformation, which is generally consistently positive, that even people that start out misinformed, when they're given updated information, they update their beliefs. That doesn't always have downstream effects to kind of their attitudes and behaviors, but sometimes it does, and gotta start somewhere. So we had reason to believe that correction could be effective, and started playing with this idea of observed correction. Since 2014, we've done 8 studies with a total of 24 different comparison conditions, and on different topics like the Zika virus, raw milk, sunscreen, the flu vaccine, COVID vaccine, a bunch of others that I'm not thinking of right now. And we've tested it on different simulated platforms as well. So everything from Facebook to Twitter to Instagram to live video platforms. And just to give you a sense of what this looks like, this is a couple of our stimulus materials. So on the left, you can see the Twitter. One example that we've used from Twitter, in this case, the CDC is directly rebutting misinformation that's shared about the Zika outbreak, saying this information has been discredited by world leaders. So you can see that the comment thread is there, so that it has that direct rebuttal aspect. And then in this example is a screenshot from a Facebook Live video that we did, with the comments had the correction in it. And interestingly, this was actually our least successful attempt at correction ever, we think, because people just didn't see the comments, right? So the video is continuing to play as the comments are scrolling on the right, and people are just drawn to the video more than they are to the comments. So a lot of people never saw the corrective information in the first place. So again, going back to kind of what does a platform give you, and how does it design what you're going to see or not see, those kinds of choices make a big difference. So this is what we find. We find really consistent evidence that witnessing correction makes people more accurate in their beliefs. So here we're looking at percent change in misperception. So lower numbers are better because you're less misinformed. We've actually flipped this graph since then and talked more about belief accuracy instead of misperceptions, but this is the version that I had ready. And you can see that across all of the conditions with this 1.5 exceptions, so the one that I just mentioned is the sunscreen study, the video study, and the flu vaccine, we had almost no effect, essentially. But interestingly, for both of these, those change when we account for other things that I'll tell you about in a minute. But what I want you to take away from this graph is not any particular bar, but just the consistency of the effects across platform, across topic, across time. And notably, when we restrict these studies to only those where we have a recall measure after the fact, so we ask them, do you remember what the correction said? We don't ask it that way because that would be a leading question, but we ask, what what did the comment say, or like whatever the reply was. And among those people that remember the correction, we actually see much larger effects. So it goes from about a 6% median decrease to an 18% median decrease. So we think this is really important from a social media design perspective and from a public messaging perspective, that it's important to make your corrective information as memorable, as visible, as bright, as covered in pictures, all of those kinds of things that make something memorable, because that's going to actually increase the impact of the corrective information. And you can see here, even the sunscreen study now is reducing misperceptions once we account for recall. Notably, in studies where we have measured misperceptions before the intervention, which we don't always do because sometimes we're worried about priming people on the subject, but when we do, the decrease in misperceptions is actually largest among people that are most misinformed to start with. So if you were thinking maybe this is only, helping accurate people become more accurate, that's not what we find. We find that people that are more misinformed are actually going to improve more from seeing corrective information. So hopefully I've convinced you that this is an effective tool for mitigating misinformation. Obviously not the only thing we should do about misinformation, but something that can help. And you might imagine that professional communicators could do a very good job of this. So I showed you an example before of the CDC directly correcting on Twitter. It's worth saying out loud that the CDC does not actually directly correct people on Twitter for the most part. They mostly just kind of push out broadcast information using their social media platforms. And that's true of most public health organizations. So that got us thinking, why don't we see public health organizations doing more of this, where they're directly like finding misinformation and responding to it in the wild? So we interviewed two kinds of professional communicators. One that we call practitioners or professionals, we're still playing with the P words here, which are public health communication specialists at public health organizations like the CDC, WHO, local US-based health organizations, and ask them about how they think about misinformation, how they think of social media as part of their strategy, how they think about correction. We also, you can see on the right here, we have publishers. We also interviewed 8 fact checkers from 5 different continents and asked about how they engaged with misinformation on social media as well. So to answer the question, do professional communicators correct? According to our definition, the answer is no. So if we, mostly no, some of them do, but most of them don't. If we go back to the requirements of observed correction, excuse me, direct rebuttal, accurate information, and witnesses, in the case of public health professionals and fact checkers, they definitely are sharing accurate information. That's actually the thing that they say is most important to them, is creating accurate information and making it available to the public. There are definitely witnesses to that information, right? So people that follow fact checkers or follow public health organizations are definitely seeing that accurate information being shared. But the missing element here is the direct rebuttal. So the vast majority of people that we talked to in these 2 roles did not want to directly engage with misinformation on social media. So why not? The major concerns they had were, first, that it wouldn't work. So either it wouldn't make people better informed, the people seeing it would be more confused than if they hadn't seen a correction, different aspects of that concern. They were particularly concerned that people would respond harshly, and a lot of them actually had specific examples of kind of the toxic responses they had gotten from the public, even if they weren't directly engaging in correction, just getting hate mail or rude comments or things like that for things that they shared on social media. So that was a big concern for a lot of the communicators that we spoke with. And then finally, almost to a person, they mentioned that there just aren't enough resources to do this. So public health organizations and journalistic operations often just don't have the resources they need to do everything they would like to do. And when they have to prioritize doing one thing versus another, direct rebuttal of misinformation was just not something that rose to the top. So they saw it as being much more important to invest the resources they did have in creating accurate information and making it available, rather than spending the time and resources to directly engage with misinformation on social media. So that is what the concerns of that set of people look like. But if all of the experts that I just talked about, the public health organizations, the journalists, chose not to do this, it could still work at scale if social media users chose to do it. And we have work that shows that social media users can actually be quite effective at correcting each other, almost on par with expert organizations. So if we see that lots of social media users are doing this, we could still achieve the scale that we need to be combating misinformation. So do social media users correct each other? Once again, the answer is mostly no. So this is actually a really interesting situation we found ourselves in. I'm going to go off on a slight tangent here. So this is a sort of thing that's very difficult to measure effectively. So we would expect this, even in an ideal world, to be a relatively rare behavior, right? So we know empirically that people don't actually see that much misinformation on social media. Most people in the 2016 election context, for instance, in the US, I think only like 3% of people saw like a great deal of misinformation, judging by their actual digital trace data. So if we're actually looking at what websites they go to and judging the veracity of those websites, which obviously is very intensive to do, we don't see that much misinformation. But people have this perception that they see a lot of misinformation. And I think that's an interesting paradox to start with, that we need to spend more time as researchers unpacking, is why do people think they see so much more misinformation than they actually do empirically? Is it that they're calling something misinformation that we are not thinking about as misinformation? Is it that they're hearing about misinformation as being a problem, and so they kind of make an inference that if it's a big problem, then they must be seeing it on their own social media? I think that's a fascinating question, but that's getting in the weeds a little. But it's difficult to measure how often people are correcting, because most people are never correcting, and most people don't even have the opportunity to correct because they're not even seeing seeing misinformation in the first place. So we might, like an ideal data set would be everybody's digital trace data with, misinformation tagged as misinformation, and then we can see when do they respond to it and what does that response look like, and how often is that response corrective, and all of that kind of thing. But obviously that data just doesn't exist in the world. So the first way we tried to measure this, and some computer scientists have tried to kind of observe this happening, that's limited by the fact that a lot of corrections happen without a link, and the way that computer scientists tend to identify a correction is by having a corrective link contained in it. So they're probably underestimating correction, but anyway, that's a separate thing entirely. So the first way we tried to measure whether people were engaging in correction was just asking them in a survey. And the numbers that we saw in the surveys that we did were kind of off the charts. So they were like around 50% of people. These are all American samples, I should say. And when we limited it to people who had only said that they saw misinformation on social media, the numbers are even higher. So people are saying like 70% of the time I engage in correction or something, which we know is just a big giant lie, right? Like there's no way that people are engaging in correction that much. So we interpret those numbers as more of a sense of a norm, right? Like the social desirability bias that leads you to say that you do this suggests that people think it's a good thing to do, even though we know they're not actually doing it that frequently. So the next way we tried to measure this was in qualitative interviews. So we interviewed 32 social media users last year and asked them about kind of like, how do you engage with misinformation when you see it on your feed? How do you decide to respond to it? If you respond, what does that look like? Can you tell us about specific examples of this? Different things like that. And this yielded some really rich data about kind of how they were approaching this idea. So once again, going back to our requirements of observed correction, the most common way that we saw correction happen among people in our qualitative among our social media users was they would engage in direct rebuttal of misinformation, and they would include accurate information, but they would do it in a place that there was no witness. So people would regularly tell us, if I'm going to correct someone, if I see misinformation, I don't want to do it on social media. That's going to embarrass them. It's going to make them mad. Other people might get mad and like pile on and respond rudely to me. And so if I'm going to correct somebody, I want to do it in a place where they can see my face, where they can hear my tone of voice. So really talking specifically and fascinatingly about the specific affordances that text-based communication, which is most of what we have on social media, is not allowing them to have the kind of nuanced conversation that they feel like they need to have when they're dealing with something as sensitive as telling somebody that they shared something that's wrong. So that was really interesting to us, that some people, and again, this isn't everyone, a lot of people told us like, I'm just going to ignore it. I'm never going to engage with misinformation. That's just not my job. But a lot of the people that said that they would engage wanted to engage in a way that they thought was more respectful to the person that had shared the misinformation. And to them, that respect came from doing it somewhere that was less public. So there may actually be, and again, going back to like what we can measure and what we can't, there may actually be quite a bit of correction happening on social media that we're just not seeing because it's happening through private messaging, or it's happening through somebody calling or FaceTiming someone to let them know that they shared something that's not true. So that I think is very interesting. And the reasons that they gave were very similar to what we heard from the professionals. So they were also worried that it wouldn't work. And interestingly, people talked specifically about backfire effects, this idea that if you tell somebody they're wrong, they'll actually become more wrong, which empirically we have no good evidence from at this point. The backfire effect that was found in 2010 has been pretty ironically debunked by additional research. So we're pretty confident that backfire effects are very rare. But people were worried that it wouldn't work, that it would make people more confident and more defensive about their beliefs. They were worried also about toxic comments, and particularly worried about kind of a community of toxic people banding together against them. And they were particularly worried about maintaining relationships with the people in their network who might have shared misinformation. So that also ties back to the idea of doing it somewhere other than public social media, that they thought that that was a way to lose a friendship. And several people actually related stories to us of friends that had unfriended them or blocked them on social media because they had tried to correct them. So people are not doing this that much. Is there some way that we can get them to engage in more correction? So based on those interviews, we pulled out a lot of the themes that people told us they were worried about and designed a simple messaging experiment to see if we could kind of push on some of those beliefs about how correction would work or not work. to get people to do it more. So like I said, we just did this yesterday. So this is hot off the presses. And this is what it looks like. So first they got a PSA that was designed to look like a social media ad or banner kind of thing. In this particular case, we're trying to convince them that corrections are effective. So there's some data showing that corrections make people more accurate. And there's this little did you know box saying corrections work. Research shows that responding to someone who has shared misinformation with accurate information helps them become more accurate on that topic too. And there were 6 different versions of this plus a control where they saw different themes. And I'll talk about what those different themes were in just a second. Then they saw a post that contained misinformation. So in this case, it's saying that sunscreen changes your DNA. And we asked them how likely they would be to respond to this post on a 7-point scale. If they said they would respond, we asked them how they would respond. Actually, we asked them how they would respond, whether they said they would respond or not. But I'm not going to show you that data today because, again, collected yesterday. So I'm just showing you the likelihood of response. So the different messages that we tried are from left to right here. So this is the control condition. They just saw a PSA about texting and driving, distracted driving. Don't use your phone while you're driving. In the correction effective condition, that's the one you just saw. So it's trying to show you that correction is particularly effective. Trying to get the idea that people pay attention to comments. So again, the idea of impact, right? If you comment on something, people are going to pay attention to that. Notably, that's actually borne out by empirical research, especially among younger people. So Gen Z uses comments to decide what's true quite regularly. And then observed correction is effective. So not just correction in general, but this idea that people will see your correction and that will be effective for them, increasing their accuracy as well. And then 2 different norm measures here. So people should engage in correction, or people think that people should engage in correction. And then people actually do engage in correction. So saying that this happens a lot. This is trying to get at this concern about toxic comments. So the PSA here was saying that social media companies are cracking down on bad actors to reduce kind of the toxicity of the conversation environment. So excited to share this for the first time. This is what we found. So the green ones are significantly different compared to the control. And again, the outcome here is how likely would you be to share this, where higher numbers are more likely to, how likely would you be to respond to this, where higher numbers are more likely to respond. And you can see that in general, people are not saying that they're very likely to respond, which actually we think makes sense, right? Most people are not going to respond to most social media posts that they see. So that's good that most people are saying that they're not very likely to respond. But we see the green ones that I highlighted here are significantly different than the control. So we are, when we're giving people these messages, it is slightly moving their willingness to engage in these kinds of behaviors. And I think that this is really promising, given that this is, a 10-minute exposure, not even a 10-minute exposure, a 10-minute experiment where all they're seeing is one message. And, think about how we could potentially move this if this was more of a concerted education campaign over time with repeated exposures. So I think that there's a lot of promise here. But to highlight the results, what we found is that explaining that correction and observed correction are effective, make people more willing to do this. And then both of the norm measures, so people think that you should do this and other people do this, all had a positive increase. On attention to comments, that was never kind of the strongest manipulation. And the trolling one, for consistency, we made all of those graphs that you saw in the PSA. So this graph was always a 60 to 40 kind of ratio. just so that we could make sure it was not the numbers that was doing the work, but it was actually the message. And we think that telling people that only 40% of comments are toxic on social media is probably not that compelling to convince them that there's not that much toxic content out there, because that's actually still quite a lot. So I think different versions of these messages could potentially also be effective, but this is very much a proof of concept to see if there's anything we can do to move the needle here. So observed correction is effective. It makes people more accurate in their beliefs. It's scalable. So if more people do it, then it actually has the potential to have a very large reach. It's not reaching its full potential because people are not doing it as much as we might hope that they would. But I also want to emphasize that this is only part of the solution. So I don't want anyone to come away from this talk thinking that it's people's responsibility, or even your responsibility as an individual social media user, to deal with misinformation on social media. I would strongly encourage you to do it. I think that the evidence is there that it, is worthwhile. But I don't think it's reasonable for us to put all of the burden of responsibility on individual social media users. And the way we talk about this in our book is a model you may have seen regarding like COVID-19, which sometimes people call the Swiss cheese virus, because Swiss cheese has holes in it. And so if one mitigation measure has a hole in it, which means it's not 100% effective, which no mitigation measure is 100% effective, then the virus can slip through that hole. But hopefully the different measures that we take are lined up in such a way that it becomes increasingly unlikely that the virus is successful at spreading and replicating, the more things that we layer on top of each other. So you can think of this as a layered approach to, in this case, COVID-19, but in our case, misinformation on social media. So yes, I think that users and experts should engage in correction of misinformation on social media, but I don't think that that's where we should stop. So we should also have media literacy campaigns. We should also have stronger pressure on platforms to take active measures against known misinformation. We should engage in content moderation. We should have regulation that's appropriate for each society, as is consistent with whatever norms they decide they have as a society. So there are lots of different elements of this, and it should not just be it should not just be about social media users doing all of the work. And the metaphor that I like to use here is, when I drive across a bridge, no one expects me to stop and check to see if it's safe, right? That's not my job. I don't have the expertise. I'm not an engineer. I honestly wouldn't even know what to look for. And it's not reasonable for me to make that kind of a decision on a regular basis. We have appropriate regulation to ensure that the infrastructure that we use is safe and available. And probably there's a parallel for that when it comes to our information ecosystems as well. So I will stop there to make sure that I have time for questions. And thank you very much for having me today.
Yeah, thanks so much for sharing, which is pretty thought-provoking and informational. Particularly appreciate that you shared a lot of your newest findings with your new data. And so during your presentation, one thing that I feel quite intriguing is that you found that people don't correct because lots of them believe that corrections won't work. To me, this might be a manifestation of the post-truth phenomena, that even though you provide evidence to them, they would still act, defensively to themselves. Yeah. So we still have like 15 minutes or 10 minutes. So our audience, our students, do you have any questions? If you have any questions, just unmute yourself and we can have a Q&A section. Okay. Also, you can, if you are inconvenient to unmute, you can also leave your comment in the chat so that I can read the question on your behalf. Any questions?
Good morning, Professor. Thank you so much for your speech. And I have two questions for you. The first one is misperception can usually be measured by surveys or experiments, but how do you think how to evaluate how much people were misinformed through qualitative interviews? And another question is how to confirm whether the backfire effects of misinformation correction really exist. Thank you so much.
Yeah, great questions. Thank you. So the first question, how do we evaluate if people have misperceptions in our interviews? So there's kind of two answers to that. One is we actually recruited people for our interviews through a survey. So we do have some measures of misinformation belief for them. I don't think we've ever actually matched those up, partly because so we only asked about a relatively narrow set of misinformation beliefs in the survey because you can only ask so many questions in the survey. And in our interviews, people really talked about all sorts of topics. So it was still kind of, during the height of the not the height of the pandemic, but still, still there was a lot of COVID still when we did these interviews, and people talked a lot about COVID, and that's what our misperceptions measures were about. But they also talked about all sorts of random things. So my favorite one was somebody shared that somebody had posted on misinformation that on average you swallow one spider per year while you're sleeping. And they were like, well, that seems plausible, I guess, but I've never thought about it, and also pretty gross that you're swallowing spiders while you're asleep. But then they looked it up and it turns out it's not true, which is great because I would prefer not to be swallowing spiders in my sleep. But anyway, so like they talked about random things. So it's kind of hard to say like what we measured in the survey doesn't necessarily match up to what they're talking about in the interviews. So that's one answer to it. The other answer to it is it did sometimes come out in our interviews that people were talking about, and we asked people about different things. So we asked them, do you correct? Have you been corrected? Have you seen correction? And sometimes when people were talking about this, it would become obvious that they actually were misinformed. So like either they had been corrected, which sometimes they admitted, but sometimes they would say like that they were right and somebody like corrected them, but that was not right. And that was just not true. They were actually wrong. But sometimes they would say that they were engaging in correction, but it would become clear that like the topic they were talking about, they were actually wrong about. So that's a particular concern, that people that are misinformed are out there trying to correct people. So yeah, that's the second part of the question, which is that we essentially didn't try to measure it through the interviews, but it sometimes kind of emerged organically. What evidence we do have on that front of how often people are misinformed and correcting is kind of mixed. We think it happens sometimes, but it doesn't seem to happen that often. But most of the time we're relying on survey data for that, and we don't fully believe the reports of people's experiences on social media, so it's a little tricky. That was a very long and not very satisfactory answer to that question. Your second question about backfire effects. So in 2010, Nyhan and Reifler published this thing that seemed to contain a backfire effect, and it was specifically about weapons of mass destruction in Iraq. And when people corrected them, they became more misinformed. So it was almost like, sometimes people call this like a partisan cheerleading effect, right? So you get so reminded of your identity by being corrected that it actually makes you dig in deeper to that identity, which means say that you believe the misinformation related to that identity even more. So this was a very impactful article in 2010. But since then, we have found basically no evidence for it. So there have been a lot of replications of this on a lot of topics, including the original topic But also, and even in that article, they have a couple of topics, and that's the only one that they find a backfire effect for, but nobody ever remembers that there are other topics that they didn't find a backfire effect for. But there have been multiple studies. So there's a big overview of this by Ethan Porter and Thomas Wood. There's also some work by Bryony Swire Thompson that's trying, like, they have tried really hard to see if they can get people to engage in this backfire effect and have found no evidence for it. So we're pretty convinced as a field at this point that backfire effects are, I wouldn't say like non-existent, but are probably very rare. There are only very specific circumstances, which we don't exactly know what those circumstances are, but it seems like most of the time, when you give people corrective information, even when that corrective information goes against some kind of identity that they hold strongly, they still update their beliefs about that topic. Now, I said earlier, not necessarily downstream beliefs. So a great example of this is Bryony Swire Thompson has this piece from the 2020 election, I think, where they correct people who are Donald Trump supporters. And apologies that so much of the research in this area is US based, which is, you know, a huge problem. And I hope everybody in this room is doing research on other contexts besides the US, because US is weird and we need more research on other countries. But having said that, so they look at Donald Trump supporters, correct them, give them corrective information about things that Donald Trump has said that are not true. And people say, yes, okay, that's not true, but it doesn't change their opinion of Donald Trump at all. So that it doesn't make them support him less. It doesn't make them less likely to vote for him. And so that is a broader problem, that like we are able to it seems like we're able to correct people on the facts, but it doesn't necessarily translate into the kinds of relationships between facts and outcomes that we would like it to. So I hope that sort of answered your question.
Yeah, thank you so much for the answer. Any other questions from our audience? I see a question in the chat from Peng Ting. Hi, Dr. Bode. Question 1, I wonder how the samples were selected. Who can be selected to the study? And question 2 is the misinformation content identified by health professionals?
Great questions, which I totally glossed over in the presentation. So I appreciate you bringing these up. The samples vary depending on the study. So we have everything, most of our samples are from online convenience panels. So those are like Lucid, Prolific, MTurk, Cloud Research, various online panels. We have a couple of student samples in there as well, although we've moved away from that in recent years. The only requirements for selection are usually that you're over 18, that you are residing in the US, again, apologies for US centric research, and that you, for the online panels, we usually have requirements about like you've done at least 100 assignments before and you have a 95% approval rate, which is just supposed to improve data quality. In some samples, we also have an attention check, which we use to select people to make sure that people are, you know, spending at least a little bit of time paying attention to the stimulus materials. On the second question, the misinformation content we use in our studies. So we have actually a whole article about how to define misinformation in research, which is really kind of complicated when you get into the weeds of it. And we make an argument that like you have to be really confident one way or another, and you have to be really transparent about how you're making the decision about what counts as misinformation, which is not to say that you can't include stuff in studies that is not necessarily misinformation, that's just misleading or malinformation or something along those lines, but you want to be very clear about that situation. So in our studies, we have tried to select topics which we think there is very clear scientific consensus on. Our studies are basically entirely health and science misinformation studies for that reason, because it's been very difficult to find consensus from experts on other topics. And we are very careful that we include the relevant scientific consensus. So whether that's a meta-analysis or a systematic review or something like that on the topic, when we include, well, first of all, in our debriefing. So after our participants take the study, at the end, we have a long and detailed debriefing where we're telling them what is true and what is not true and what the scientific consensus is on the topic. And then we also include that in any articles that we publish as well, to make sure that everybody's kind of on the same page about what's true and not true. Having said that, this is like, I don't know, it's a very hairy issue, because even where there's scientific consensus. So as an example, we had a study a couple of years ago where the piece of misinformation was that fluoride in your drinking water could lower IQ. And there are lots of places around the world that put fluoride in drinking water because it improves dental health. And especially for low-income populations that can drink tap water for free, but may not have access to dental care, that is a really good way to increase dental health of the entire population. And for years and years, there's been no evidence that that is related to any negative health outcomes or intelligence outcomes in the case of IQ. While we were running the study, there was an article that came out, and again, it's like one article versus, 100 that have said the opposite, but there was an article that came out that said, in some cases, in this one particular community, among pregnant women who were drinking fluoridated water, there was some evidence that their kids, their future offspring, had very slightly lower IQ. And it was like 2 points or something, which is almost nothing, right? That's like practically margin of error. But so that's like a really difficult thing to deal with when what counts as true and not true is kind of constantly changing. And that's even more true with some of the issues that we care the most about. So for example, during the pandemic, we cared a lot about misinformation, but the whole nature of truth was changing from day to day as we learned more about this coronavirus that we didn't know anything about before. Novel is like in the name. COVID, the V part, I think, is not whatever. Novel is, novel coronavirus. We didn't know anything about it. And so it was really hard to assess clearly what was true and what was not true in that context. And you see that with things like, are masks effective or are they not effective? I won't even get started on the lab leak back and forth. And, where did it actually come from? We don't know. So that is really problematic. That some of the issues that we care the most about are the hardest to really pin down what is 100% true and everybody, all the experts agree is true. So that's a good question.
Yeah, thanks for the answer. Any other questions? Yeah, I see another question from Chen Luo. Yeah, thank you, Professor Bode, for this thought-provoking and informative lecture. I have one question regarding self-reported misinformation exposure experience. Since it is highly susceptible to social desirability bias, self-enhancement tendency, and inaccurate memory, do we have better strategies to measure people's misinformation exposure to minimize measurement error in a survey, such as showing them some actual misinformation cases?
Yeah, so I 100% agree that measuring self-reported misinformation exposure is really fraught. And we just basically don't believe it. One of my friends that works in this area likes to cite this survey that found that people said 75% of what they saw in misinformation was not true. And that's ridiculous, right? Like if 75% of what you were seeing is not true, you would just stop using social media, I think. So it's a huge problem. I think the best strategy, if what you really care about is exposure to misinformation, I think the best strategy is digital trace data, which is going to be significantly less biased than survey reports. The downside of that is there is at least some bias in who is willing to opt in to having that data collected versus who is not. But I think that some of that bias can be mitigated by paying people more. So basically giving people lots of money makes them willing to do all sorts of things that they're otherwise somewhat hesitant to do. In terms of how to measure it better in a survey, I don't know. So it sounds like what you're thinking is, could we show them specific topics of misinformation and then say, have you seen this on social media or not? Is that what you have in mind, Chen?
Yes, I think so. And I believe this is what I mean, is that showing them some actual real cases about misinformation and ask, did you ever expose to them or something else? Yeah.
Yeah, so I think people have done that. I don't know. I think it would probably be slightly better than just asking them in general, how often do you see misinformation? Having said that, we also have good evidence that people are not good at remembering where they've seen something. So if you say, like, have you seen this on social media? And they say yes, maybe they saw it on social media, or maybe they, saw it on a blog post, or their friend told them about it, or whatever, because we just don't really encode that source information very well when we come across information. So I think it would be a better version in that regard, that I think it would reduce some of the over-reporting bias. I think it would be less good in that you can only ask about so many things. So you'd have to be really careful about which topics you were asking people about to get a sense of that. So yeah, it's hard to measure.
Okay, thank you for your answer. Thank you.
Yeah, great question.
Yeah, thanks. Yeah, I do agree that maybe digital trace data might be more helpful. Yeah. Any other questions? I think there are a lot of, yeah, please.
I have a question. That as a public health department during the COVID pandemic, whether the CDC will share their attention to this misinformation on social media, and whether they will be responsible for the correction of such misinformation on social media.
Whether the CDC during the pandemic was engaging in this, is that the question? Yeah, mostly not. So most of the public health organizations very much see their role as distributing accurate information, but not necessarily directly correcting it. So they I don't know quite how to say this. They indirectly correct it. So for example, the WHO during the pandemic had this series that they called Mythbusters, which were kind of infographics that I might actually be able to find one real quick. Infographics that they put on their websites, and they had common myths that people were worried about with regard to COVID, and then had that myth debunked. So they would say that is correction of misinformation, but it's not correction in the way that we are talking about it, because it is not a direct rebuttal. So let me look at this. So this is one of them, that hot peppers might cure your COVID. That is not actually true, right? So adding pepper to your super meal does not cure COVID-19. And then it has all this other information about how you can protect yourself against COVID, right? So stay at least a meter away from people, wash your hands, and then, just generally take care of yourself, right? To improve your immune system. So when we talk to public health professionals, they think of that as very much engaging in correction. It's not our definition of correction, but I mean, obviously it's still important, but that's very much the way that they see their role, is like creating this information and putting it out into the world so that people can use it the way they want to. And when we ask them about it, like, they are all about, they would love people to be using these kinds of infographics and stuff in their social corrections with each other. And to some extent people do. And it's certainly worthwhile creating that, we call it accessible corrective evidence, ACE, that people can use in their corrections, but they are not doing very much of that, like, actual, here is a comment and here is our threaded comment where we're saying that's not true. That is just not something that they have the resources to do.
Thanks for sharing.
Sure.
Yeah, thank you so much. I think we're on time right now. So thank you for coming to our get together. I wish that you enjoyed attending our event. And Leticia, thank you so much for sharing your important research. And I do hope that I can maybe see you in person in AEJMC in the upcoming August in DC. Yeah,
Oh,
thank you so much. Yeah.
Yeah, I look forward to it. And thank you everybody for joining us tonight. I know that this is not necessarily what you wanted to do at 8 o'clock at night. So I appreciate you tuning in.
Thank you so much for your time. Yeah, thank you.
Thanks, take care.
Yeah, yeah.